So, Tyler, one thing I wanted to ask you is about your overall sentiment for the US over the next century or so. I just finished reading two books, one by someone who I believe is a friend of yours, Balaji Srinivasan. He wrote The
Sure.
Network State, recently just came out. And then someone who I'm assuming, are also familiar with, Ray Dalio, wrote a book called New World Order. Both of those books, in one way or another, point to the decline of the US and are, at least with respect to the US, I think, fairly pessimistic. And I'm curious if you share that sentiment and what your sense is for where the US is headed over the next few hundred years.
A few hundred years is a little hard to say. Even 100 years is hard to say. But for the foreseeable future, I'm very bullish on the entire Anglosphere, the US, Canada, also Ireland, Southern England, Australia, New Zealand. I think the English language is worth more and more. For all our problems, we have relatively functional forms of government with some accountability. And you look at China, people were praising it to the skies, like Ray Dalio, and now they're stuck in this terrible zero COVID policy, headed toward a recession or depression, can't fix their falling birth rate, put 1 million people in concentration camps, arguably wish to invade and take over Taiwan, and they're still locking up their, significant parts of their citizenry. What kind of system is that? So autocracy often looks good for a while, but information flows to the leaders, get cut off, or you get a bad leader, and then they start making terrible, major correlated mistakes. And that's what we're seeing with China. I'm not bullish on China at all.
That's really interesting. Yeah, I read recently that at its continued birth rate, China will have a population of 600 million by 2100, which was mind-blowing.
I would way rather live in Limerick than in Shanghai. That's one way to put it.
That definitely drives the point home for anyone who knows Limerick. What else is it that makes you bullish about the West, first of all, and then what changes, as per the argument that yourself and Patrick make within the Atlantic article, what changes would make you even more bullish on the West?
I'm a big believer in democracy. I fully understand on any given day it looks and sounds very ugly and you make a lot of mistakes. But its error correction properties over time, I think, are unparalleled. And if you look at US, Canada, Ireland, UK, Australia, New Zealand, those countries are very solidly democracies, and I think will be so for a long time. They are also mostly capitalistic. Now, I don't believe in unrestrained capitalism, but capitalism and big business and prosperity and growth and just doing things and entrepreneurship and startups are pretty strong in those parts of the world. And those parts of the world also, with some exceptions, but they don't have too many national security problems. That is, they're not next door to major enemies. Australia, China is a little tricky, but they're not Ukraine, they're not Belarus, they're not Poland. They're pretty secure, most of all US and Canada. And I think that will count for more in the near future.
Tyler, if you were, and I know this goes against your like of democracy, but let's just imagine, as a thought experiment, you were the unrestricted ruler of the US, what would be 3 initiatives or changes that you would institute to maximally accelerate progress?
I would have much more immigration into the United States, both high-skilled and low-skilled. As a general rule, I would just have us treat our foreigners better when they show up at the border, even if they're tourists. I would radically reform science policy to make ours much more a government of science and raise the status of science and bring better management and more risk-taking into science. I would have more YIMBY rather than NIMBY. And in general, I would just try to make the regulatory state simpler, more transparent. I would say on climate, have tougher regulations, but simpler ones. So we need to do something. But regulations are so complicated. You start a business, you can't even tell whether or not you're breaking the law. And that to me suggests something has gone wrong.
Simplification. Simplification of the tax code as well, I'm assuming.
Absolutely. More transparency. I think we have too many layers of government that have a veto over different things that happen, too many layers of environmental review. It costs far too much to build a mile of subway track in New York City. just so many veto points accumulate and they don't go away. So we need to reverse that. It's a hard thing to do as one person being, I guess you had me as dictator, president, whatever, but I would at least push in that direction.
Are there any changes to the tax code specifically that you've thought a lot about or fantasized about that would really positively impact growth, do you think?
Well, I think we did a good thing in cutting our corporate income tax rate. I worry that capital gains are not indexed for inflation. That matters more now that the rate of inflation is higher. In general, I would be fairly lenient on the taxation of capital income and encourage risk taking. We have a lot of backdoor vehicles of having people save tax-free. Like all things considered, it's better than nothing, but it's so complicated, so non-transparent. We ought to just make all that simpler and have more open, obvious, non-tricky ways of helping people save tax-free.
Yeah, no,
I would consider personal savings accounts for some portion of medical expenditures. We had that briefly. Obama basically did away with it. It can't run your whole healthcare system, but at the margin, I think it's useful. Get people spending more of their own money rather than relying on third-party payment.
One of the big arguments that I've heard around government spending is that the focus is on the spending and not on the value or the return that is generated from the spending, and that there is just enormous amounts of low-hanging fruit for increasing returns on government spending. So I'm curious if there's any changes with respect to visibility or accountability or approach that you would love to see in terms of government spending.
Well, as a general rule, each year we're spending more and more on the elderly. I would prefer that we skew our spending more toward younger people. So you can always argue how much should the government spend, but when you're spending more on the old, I think that's not healthy, and we're neglecting our young, and they're the seed capital for America's greatness in the decades to come.
If what you've heard on Flow Research Collective Radio has been helpful, please consider doing us a solid and leaving us a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you are listening to this. Reviews help us connect to a wider audience so we can get these peak performance principles out to more people.